Low propensity swing voters are just often overlooked because they're seen as unreliable, but that's why they're such a great untapped resource. The more data you can feed into a model, the better. Feed your door knocking information back in. Feed your volunteer list back into your models. Feed everything that you get, your email signups. I like to think of data as the map and your gut as the compass. So the data is telling you where you can go, but your gut is telling you where you should go.
Welcome to the Art of Campaigning. I'm Caitlin Huxley, and I'm here today with Mike Yelovich, a pollster, political and nonprofit consultant, and my good friend. We're going to chat about data, and I hope you guys get something out of it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, happy to have you here. Something that's really bugged me for the longest time is when we do targeting, we separate folks into buckets, right? There's high propensity, low propensity, affinity for our party against us, right? And then obviously we target those swing voters who are in the middle, and we knock on their doors, we give them calls with the goal of separating them and pushing out the ID'd supporters, persuading the, whatever. But I feel like in all of this, if we're going to be feeding these people into our GOTV funnel, shouldn't we then be setting ourselves up for success by targeting the low propensity swing voters?
Absolutely. Yeah. Targeting the high propensity swing voters, it's the common idea that they're low hanging fruit, and that's why everyone goes after them. Low propensity swing voters, on the other hand, are just often overlooked because they're seen as unreliable, but that's why they're such a great untapped resource. If you can identify and persuade them to turn out, that will go a long way in helping campaigns, especially smaller campaigns or campaigns that the election's decided within a point or two, or races where you're going against an incumbent who's been entrenched for years and years. I think that targeting these people is very important because they're not going to be as bogged down with messaging as other targets that you may have. So if you can really convince them, you're kind of like doubling down on the impact that you can get. And one great example of targeting and talking to these low propensity swing voters is if you look back to Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin's race in 2021. He was the first Republican to be elected statewide since 2009. And that campaign was able to increase turnout, which brought them across the finish line. I think it was 55% of voters turned out in 2021, which was up 7-8 points from the previous gubernatorial election. So yeah, absolutely. Identifying those lower turnout but persuadable voters is definitely something that campaigns need to be thinking about, and they'll overlook it at their own peril.
So the pushback I usually get from suggesting these sort of uncommon strategies is that they're going to be more expensive is really the problem. You're going to spend more money and more time to talk to people who ultimately the candidate often feels like doesn't vote, right? So that, and then obviously what constitutes an actual swing voter is a bit subjective and sort of based on how you're identifying swing versus, high affinity for one of the parties. I usually look at propensity to vote in a primary election and use that. And obviously, the top of the ticket usually runs some models that you can kind of borrow for your own. But aside from that, I find that low propensity swing universe is massive. And
absolutely,
like I said, candidates are worried that they're going to spend a lot of money on people who ultimately don't vote. Now, you were involved in the Youngkin race, right? So what is it you guys did there that we can steal?
Really good modeling is the first step, and identifying those buckets of voters that may be overlooked. And you have to talk to each different bucket, so to say, differently. So the more high propensity swing voters, obviously, you're not focusing as much on GOTV. It is just persuasion. But with the lower turnout people, you really need to drive home the personal connection, whether that's from door knocking and having someone in front of that voter that they can connect with, or creating micro coalitions. That was something that really worked well on the Youngkin campaign. Was
what is that?
Building groups of like Hispanic teachers or women, identifying groups that will support your campaigns or your issues, whatever you're campaigning on, and then building groups around that to drive turnout and create a sense of belonging with the campaign among the voters. That will go a long way in both driving turnout and in persuasion.
Okay. And so then it's like a community thing, people who I know who look like
Exactly.
me, who really resemble me. Interesting.
Exactly.
I've never really cross-referenced my coalitions before to make, obviously we've had teachers, we've had Hispanic, but never Hispanic teachers.
Yes.
That's interesting. Okay.
What have your experiences been with targeting lower propensity swing voters?
So it's always couched with what the candidate is willing to do, what the budget can handle. And so a lot of what we end up doing is to do less personal things, a text blast to the entire universe. You always try and talk them out of, but something like this, because it costs less and is going to be hopefully effective at identifying people who might be interested. Sort of going after the lowest hanging fruit amongst the highest effort voters to win.
Absolutely.
Which seems a little backwards from what you were suggesting.
Well, no, I think that is spot on, though. When I was talking about the low hanging fruit in high propensity voters, that is why lower turnout swing voters are overlooked. But I think targeting and thinking about like who are the easiest people of the hardest people to reach is definitely the first step you need to take when trying to think through a complex data and outreach strategy.
Okay, so you're saying my cheap candidates were onto something. Good.
Yes.
Good to know. So one other thing you said in there was about modeling. And so when my average client tries to use modeling, it's never made for them. Right. It is made for someone at the top of the ticket, someone who doesn't necessarily look like or speak like or represent my candidate very well. And it's almost always, one of those regression models where you're given a score between 0 and 1. And this is how likely they are to be a pro-choice or pro-life or, whatever. And then when I investigate those with something like a random forest, they almost always correlate really heavily to primary participation. Is this guy a registered Republican? Then very highly likely to be pro-life. So I've lost over the years a little bit of confidence in models like this. Can you give us a peek behind the curtain on how you model folks, how you build a model?
Yeah, building models is definitely not the easiest thing to do. You just need to have as much data as you can, and that can be very difficult for smaller campaigns. But when you're talking about good modeling, you want all of the information you can get from the voter file, obviously. You also want to be bringing in some consumer data if you have the funds for that. I think consumer data is definitely a very big influencer in helping predict people's behavior.
And are you talking magazine subscriptions? Okay.
Absolutely. And beyond. Yeah. Like if I'm subscribed to the NRA magazine, that's going to show that might be a Second Amendment supporter. Yes. Consumer data goes a long way in helping. But you mentioned how seeing that primary vote history has been a indicator of...
Yeah, heavily correlated with those models.
Yes. And I think that goes back to what I was saying of just needing more data. Voters who are turning out for primary elections are more engaged and aware generally than people who are just showing up in the general. And people who are showing up routinely in primaries are even more so. So having that additional data on primary voters is going to be telling you that these voters are more aware, more engaged, and help train your models better.
All right, interesting. So is there a practical tip you can give to, let's say, a candidate who's trying to bootstrap? Maybe they know a little Excel. They have some college kid who just took some computer science courses. Is it just don't if you can't?
I mean, modeling is definitely a science, but it is also an art. I definitely would recommend having a consultant help guide you through the modeling process, because we've worked with modeling before on dozens and dozens of campaigns. But the one thing that I would recommend is what I have been saying is just the more data you can feed into a model, the better. Feed your door knocking information back in. Feed your volunteer list back into your models. Feed everything that you get, your email signups.
Okay. So be iterating on that model, right? It's less of a set number and more of a living
Absolutely.
model as the campaign goes on. Okay. Candidates come up with some wacky ideas.
That they
How
do.
do you sense check them? How do you back up your argument that, okay, we should do this, we should follow this idea, okay, maybe that one's not so good? Do you just find it compelling to tell them, listen, I've been here, I've done this for a while, and I can tell you this sucks?
Definitely think for the question of tech or gut, it's not an either or situation. I think it's very much both. I like to think of data as the map and your gut as the compass. So the data is telling you where you can go, but your gut is telling you where you should go. So when a candidate has some out there idea that they want to do, if your gut's telling you, no, don't do that, look at the data. And if the data is there to support whatever the candidate may be saying, then test it, try it. But if the data is not there to back up a claim or an idea or an assumption about voter behavior or how to run a campaign, then you got to go with your gut and put your foot down and say, no, this isn't right.
All right, sort of a trust but verify.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's I trust my gut, but I verify it with data.
After so long in politics, you can kind of get an idea of what's going to work, what's going to be persuasive, what isn't. And then you often need that data to be able to show the big donor or the stakeholder on the campaign that, like, okay, you know, we've tried this, we've tested it out, and it shows it does or doesn't move the needle. I'm often less gentle than I think I should be. Okay, so I'm working with a client now who is getting a lot of pushback from some of the folks who are telling him that door knocking just doesn't work. And so he is feeling a lot of pressure, and he's letting that pressure pass through to the campaign strategy, trying to find other things we can do. I think a good way to convince them is, like you're saying, with data,
Right.
that personal
Absolutely.
connections are what moves the needle. And working the beer tent at the local festival does not. Again, going off the gut versus data here, you can tell when a campaign's going well, right? It's full of volunteers. It's got a good response rate at the doors. If you're doing some message testing, some polling before and after, you know, a message push, then you can see how the needle's moving. There's a couple things here. But from your perspective, is there anything that really, above all, if you can look at one metrics and say, okay, shows me that this campaign is like doing well, this one is not, etc.
So I may be slightly biased. If I were to pick one metric, I would lean towards a poll.
Weird that the pollster says this.
I know, but it is helpful. But how I truly look at it is the answer to the question is not one thing. A campaign is like a symphony. There's many parts that need to work in concert for your campaign to be a success. So you need to be looking at multiple things. Polling is a great way to tell you if you're moving in the right direction, but you also need to make sure that the grassroots support is there. So are people talking to you at the doors? Are people saying they're going to vote for you at the doors? Is your donor support there? Earned media is another thing that I looked at from all campaign sizes.
Okay.
A lot of smaller campaigns will say to me that earned media is so hard to get because everyone just wants to talk about the top of the ticket. Everyone wants to talk about Trump, Biden, Harris, the president. Especially in the United States, there's a lot of small and local newspapers out there. There are newspapers that will be representing your constituency, that can be writing about you, that can be talking about you, and people do read them.
Okay. So earned media, that's good, right? That because you have to earn it.
Absolutely. And then you do also need to pay attention to early vote returns. If you have a good data strategy, you will be identifying who's going to be likely to early vote, who you want to push to early vote, And I think 2024 really showed that early voting is no longer a Democrat only thing. Republicans are warming up to it.
Yeah, Trump embraced it pretty heavily, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that has driven a lot of turnout and has closed the gap in a lot of really close races. And keeping an eye on the returns of people that you've modeled as these are going to be our supporters, seeing that come in can help identify enthusiasm behind your campaign. People are excited and ready to get the vote out for you. They don't want to wait for election day because they're so excited to vote for you. So early
Okay.
votes is another great metric to identify if your campaign's on the right track or not.
Okay, but using that model that you created, overlaying that on
Yes.
who's actually returned their
Yes.
ballot and seeing whether or not your model says you win. So you better
Right.
have a good model, is what you're saying.
True. You will need some good modeling for that as well. Obviously, you won't know how they actually voted until election night. But if you've got a good model saying these are our supporters and you're seeing a bunch of your supporters are returning their early vote ballots, then you're heading in the right direction. Something
Okay.
went
And
right.
early on, you pitched polling, obviously.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
I think this is the one that, everybody knows. Once you get a little bit of money, you do a poll,
Hmm.
you push out your message as much as you can, you see how that moves the needle. You push out your message again, you do another poll. Is there a timeline you generally suggest here?
Using a poll to identify if your campaign's going right or wrong, you want to have some periodical polling. What I recommend to campaigns is if you are about to roll out a large ad campaign or a big persuasion effort, a poll before that is rolled out, and then shortly after you start implementing your outreach or messaging, you want to be able to see that movement, and it'll tell you if your strategy is working or not. And if it is, great, can carry on. If it's not, you might need to adjust something. A lot of campaigns, like in the summer, you're going to be wanting to start rolling out messaging to really saturate voters, get them familiar with you and your message. So in the summer, in the general election, you'll want to be testing polling quite a bit. As you get closer to election day, yes, you're going to want some polls. But by then, it's really just a spot check of, do we think we're going to win? You have less runway to adjust strategy, but that doesn't mean you can't. So yeah, in the final days of an election, it's helpful to use polling to see where you may need to do some final GOTV pushes. If the candidate you're running against is really doing heavy lifting in certain areas that you need to address, but you need to be doing polling throughout the life of your campaign.
Okay, so basically, as soon as outreach starts, you should be doing periodic polling as long as you can afford it.
Absolutely.
And then
Yes.
in the
Yes.
last couple days of the election, it's mostly a spot check to see where you need to deploy those emergency measures.
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay, very cool. That's, I think, going to be very useful to listeners. When we talk about data, it's almost always voter data. Even here, you're
Hmm.
talking about consumer data. We're really thinking about augmenting that voter file in some way, right? In building it
Hmm.
out. I mean, that's the point, right? Is to get votes from voters.
Yeah.
But you can't do that without, obviously, donors, and you can't do that without volunteers. So how do you use data to hone in your volunteer, your donor strategy?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm going to start sounding like a broken record here, but if you're able, something I love to recommend to campaigns is building a volunteer model, because those are your campaign evangelists. They are the ones who are most excited about your campaign, who are definitely going to vote for you. Because you're absolutely right. Volunteers don't need to be from your district, but the ones who are especially important to look at, because if you can identify like, oh, all of my volunteers are coming from this neighborhood or have this similar trait or background, that is a great way for you to then go recruit more volunteers that you can bring onto the campaign and help build that momentum and that excitement for your candidate. Just paying attention to the data that you get from those volunteers is important. If you have the money and the ability to build a model based off of them, even better.
So I take on a couple pro bono candidates every cycle, and they are always well deserving. People who I think have good policies, who are well positioned in competitive races, or they would be if they had cash. But for some reason, the local party just doesn't believe in them.
Mm-hmm.
They started too late, something along these lines. If you were helping one of these folks, what would you do? They have the voter file from the state, or they bought it from L2 or from I360, or, just
Mm-hmm.
downloaded it from Van or Data Center or whatever. They have some crappy version of the file with no models, no nothing. What's the highest impact thing that you would suggest they do?
You need to be able to develop a core team of volunteers, because when I think about a campaign, it truly is, it takes a village. If you don't have the local party support or whoever the powers that be are in your area, you need someone there to support you. And you're not going to be able to convince voters to vote for you if you don't have other people that you can point to that say, see, he thinks I'm right. He supports me. Having a core team of volunteers that can help you in the basics. Just start with the basics.
I see. So build some momentum, right?
Mm-hmm.
Push for the volunteers you can recruit.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe build a little model of who those people are.
Yes.
Try and get some support drummed up from the voter base. Just focusing on the fundamentals.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
It's good. That's what I like to hear. Geofencing.
Oh boy.
Not so much in the last cycle, but with all the new ways to sell my candidates digital ads, every vendor wants to talk about geofencing, right? There's a big event, let's geofence. We know what neighborhoods are good for us, so we should be geofencing off those neighborhoods. And to me, it's always felt a little bit of the new hotness. Do you do much geofencing outside of targeting people who attended an NRA event or?
Right. I think I hear a lot of vendors and consultants try to sell geofencing as this magic bullet that I just don't believe it is. I think it's a tool, but it's not a strategy. It only works when it's being integrated in a broader campaign plan. So the key to geofencing is you need to be specific and intentional with it. So in the instance that you brought up where where these voters are, yeah, that can work there. But to use a personal example, I live in a neighborhood that has a higher Hispanic population. And in the last election, there were a lot of ads that I was getting targeted with that were in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, so that's not going to do much in trying to persuade me or get me to go out and vote for a candidate or whatever cause it was pushing, because I just didn't understand. For a lower budget campaign, that can work. But if you're really trying to drive turnout or persuasion, I'd rather be spending resources targeting voters with messages that we know will work with them than just thinking about geofencing as a magic bullet to win a campaign.
Okay, so like if you hold a campaign rally, then perhaps geofence folks as
Absolutely.
likely to be supporters and then put them in your model, etc.
Yes.
But for, say, Spanish language targeting, maybe not so much.
Right.
Okay. And while you were talking, actually, there's something else I thought of. So I have had over the last, I would say, year and a half, maybe half a dozen sales calls with a sort of new kind of company. These are people who specialize in online, I don't know, traps for people. They're looking to farm out consumer data in new ways. So they have, for example, coupons for first-time moms, right? And they have this site, and you go and you put your email address, and then they send you coupons, and it's a legitimate coupon site, but there is a quote that goes something along the lines of, if you can't figure out what product this company is selling to you, then you are the product. But I've had more and more conversations with people who want to take my voter file and append their data, new ways to sell me consumer data. And I don't know if you have a better idea, being deeper in the industry than I, what the heck is going on?
Well, I just think that right now, especially in the United States, data is like the Wild West. We have very little data regulations or data privacy laws out there. There are some, but I think as a society, we need to have a more robust conversation around that. I can't particularly say I've run into many vendors trying to buy or sell consumer data in that way, in my experience, but I'm always healthily skeptical about it. I'm always skeptical of any company that is trying to pitch me on integrating their data with mine or vice versa, that is not something that I've heard of before or worked with before, that hasn't been industry tested before, because the data sector is changing at such an exponential rate.
Really, they've been popping out of nowhere trying to sell me first-time moms emails. And, one of the things actually that concerns me about this is they get the email, but they don't necessarily get your voter ID, right? They didn't ask you for your state voter ID or your address necessarily, but your email. And I've used some of these email appending services. I won't say which company I used, but those emails were absolutely trash.
Yeah.
You could go through them and see that it was clearly assigned to somebody else in the household or just another D. Suarez. I have no idea where these people come up with this person is this email sometimes. And so if they're giving me more information about first-time moms and they're doing it just randomly, saying this person is this first-time mom.
Well, to talk about emails, I think you're absolutely right about that being a problem. There's so many outdated emails and inactive emails. And honestly, it's kind of sad that from the half dozen vendors that I can think of and have used in the past, most of the time they say they've got about a 50% match rate with any data file that you send them, pending that you have enough PII, personal identifying information, to match to their data. And emails are a tricky thing to navigate. Might not always be cost effective for smaller campaigns to be looking at or targeting.
Okay, good insight. So earlier you said the U.S. probably needs to have a conversation about how we want to handle data. Are you a GDPR fan then? Do you think we should do what Europe does?
I don't know. I don't know enough about data privacy or how to regulate it in a smart way to come out here and be advocating one way or the other. What I would rather argue is that I want our elected officials to be having public conversations about it and starting the conversation about it and bringing stakeholders to the table about it. I just want to have that conversation.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Everything we've talked about here has gone a long way towards answering if I am one of the main two parties and I am running in a general election against the other of the main two parties. I'm sure a lot of our advice has been very helpful. But if I'm running in a primary, if I'm running in a municipal where maybe there isn't a top-level model accessible to me, if I'm running as a third party who, these people occasionally win. I've never seen it happen. I've never been involved in a third-party race where you got more than, a single-digit return. But it does happen. I mean, I honestly have no idea is why I'm bringing this up. How does somebody as a libertarian target voters in a way that allows them to engage with people who are actually likely to vote libertarian? And, sort of similarly is, let's say I'm running in a municipal. Where do I start? A lot of these models are correlated with party. If I'm a municipal candidate and I feel like I'm less conservative than the incumbent, then it's easier for me to target the people who are on that side of the political spectrum and I hope I get them. But there's no party next to my name. How do you overcome that in a race that's small or where you're not one of the major parties? Anything wild that you've tried that you think would work for these folks?
So when it comes to differentiating yourself from other candidates in a nonpartisan race or a smaller local race or a primary race even, it all comes down to the issues and what issues matter most to voters. If you can identify what matters to them and really set your candidate up as the person who's going to fix that, that is what's going to really make voters remember your candidate's name and who they are at the ballot box. It's really hard for smaller races and down ballot races to differentiate themselves when there's so many other top of ticket things that the media is constantly talking about. But when it comes to the issues at home, the issues that impact voters on a day-to-day level, if you say, I'm going to be the candidate that fixes that, that is what's going to push your campaign across the finish line. Campaigns need a lot of tools and resources to effectively manage their volunteers, their donors, their outreach, their data. And I know you, Caitlin, have been very much on the ground. What kind of softwares or platforms or programs are you using to help manage a campaign? What could you recommend to someone trying to run for office or a new campaign manager out there?
So in the planning process, when I'm looking at the voter file, my candidates really fall into two categories, don't have a bunch of money and have a bunch of money. And if they
Don't
have
they
a
all?
bunch of money, I'm an L2 fan. I think L2 has great data, but the bang for your buck isn't great. So if you have money, L2 is good. If you don't, a lot of the candidates try and get it from the state party or the state itself, and that data's, terrible. But then we do some modeling. We run what we can and try and find their target universes. So for that, I use Python. I just do it myself with CSVs and Python, and I know I should probably find something a little more accessible, but for me, it works. I throw that into a Google Doc, talk about it with the candidate, and then when it comes to list building, again, the lower budget candidates, I try for some of the free programs, things like HubSpot, I'm actually a fan of. I'm actually a big fan of Nation Builder. And recently I met Common is the name. It's QOMON. I don't know where these people come up with these spellings, but it's like Nation Builder Plus, and it seems relatively affordable. I'm looking forward to getting to try it this cycle.
Wonderful. That's very helpful. 2026 election is right around the corner. We got 2025 races happening now, and campaigns better be gearing up for it because it is a long road to November.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.